For almost all of human history, the idea of race didn't exist. That probably sounds impossible. Humans have fought wars for thousands of years. They conquered kingdoms, enslaved entire populations, and hated outsiders. So surely they've always been racist, right? Surprisingly, no, because hatred isn't the same as racism. Those two ideas are often treated as identical. History tells a different story. So where did the idea of race actually come from? Who decided that humanity could be divided into separate groups? And how did an idea that didn't exist for most of human history become powerful enough to reshape the entire world? To answer that, we have to begin long before the word race meant what it does today. Imagine you're standing in the middle of ancient Rome. The city is crowded with merchants, soldiers, slaves, philosophers, and travelers from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Some have dark skin. Some have pale skin. Some speak Latin. Others speak Greek, Egyptian, Celtic, or dozens of other languages. To us, this looks like a mix of different races. But to the Romans, that wasn't how they saw the world. If you asked a Roman who his enemy was, he probably wouldn't point to someone's skin color. He would point to a barbarian beyond the empire, a rival kingdom, a foreign religion, or an opposing army. Status mattered. Citizenship mattered. Power mattered. Skin color by itself usually wasn't the defining line. The same pattern appears almost everywhere we look. Ancient Greeks divided people into Greeks and barbarians. Ancient China often distinguished between Chinese civilization and surrounding peoples. Kingdoms across Africa fought neighboring kingdoms. Tribes fought tribes. Empires fought empires. Humans have always separated themselves into groups. But those groups were based on language, culture, religion, territory, or political loyalty, not the global racial categories we use today. That's our first clue. Humans didn't suddenly wake up one day and discover race. Something changed, and that change began at sea. By the late 1400s, European ships were crossing oceans they had never crossed before. Within a few decades, explorers reached the Americas. Trade routes connected Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas on a scale never seen before. For the first time in history, millions of people from distant continents were being drawn into the same expanding global system. Europeans encountered civilizations they knew almost nothing about. Different languages, different religions, different customs, different appearances. Naturally, they tried to classify what they saw. At first, these descriptions were simply observations. But over time, observation became categorization, and categorization slowly became hierarchy. Instead of asking, "How are these people different from us?" a far more dangerous question emerged. Which people are superior? That single question would change history. Because once societies begin ranking human beings, those rankings rarely stay inside books. They begin shaping laws, economies, empires, and eventually, people's lives. In the centuries that followed, philosophers, naturalists, and physicians attempted to divide humanity into fixed racial categories based on physical traits like skin color. These classifications gradually became intertwined with ideas about intelligence, morality, and civilization, even though there was no scientific basis for ranking people that way. But ideas don't spread simply because they're convincing. They spread because they're useful. And no idea proved more useful to expanding empires than the belief that some people were naturally born to rule, while others were naturally born to serve. That's where the story takes a much darker turn. Ideas alone don't change the world. People do. And throughout history, powerful ideas have often survived not because they were true, but because they benefited someone. By the 16th and 17th centuries, European empires were expanding across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. New colonies demanded enormous amounts of labor. Millions of Africans were captured, transported across the Atlantic, and forced into slavery. Of course, slavery wasn't new. It had existed for thousands of years. The Romans enslaved prisoners of war. The Greeks did it. Many African kingdoms enslaved rival groups. So did civilizations in Asia and the Middle East. But there was one crucial difference. In most earlier societies, slavery wasn't permanently tied to the idea of biological race. People became slaves because they were conquered, captured, punished, or born into slavery, not because an entire race was believed to be naturally inferior. The Atlantic slave trade gradually changed that. As the trade expanded, a difficult moral question emerged. How do you justify treating millions of human beings as property while also claiming to be a civilized society? One answer was frighteningly convenient. Convince people that those being enslaved were fundamentally different. Not just culturally different, biologically different. If one group could be portrayed as naturally less intelligent, less civilized, or somehow meant to serve others, then slavery no longer looked like oppression. It looked like the natural order. This wasn't science discovering a fact. It was an idea being used to defend an existing system. And over time, that idea spread far beyond slavery itself. In the 18th century, European scholars became fascinated with classifying the natural world. Plants were classified. Animals were classified. Eventually, humans were classified too. Some naturalists grouped people according to visible physical traits such as skin color or geographic origin. At first glance, that may not seem harmful. Humans classify things all the time. We classify animals, languages, clouds, even personalities. Classification isn't the problem. The problem begins when categories become rankings. Some thinkers didn't stop at describing differences. They claimed those differences revealed intelligence, morality, character, even destiny. Suddenly, race wasn't presented as a description. It was presented as an explanation. During the 18th and 19th centuries, measurements of skulls, facial angles, body proportions, all were used in attempts to prove that some races were naturally superior to others. Today, we know these methods were deeply flawed. Researchers often started with a conclusion, then searched for evidence to support it. It wasn't objective science. It was science being bent to fit an ideology. For decades, these ideas influenced schools, governments, immigration laws, colonial policies, and public opinion. Children grew up believing they were scientific facts. But science has an unusual habit. Eventually, corrects itself. As genetics developed during the 20th century, scientists began studying human DNA in far greater detail. What they discovered surprised many people. Humans are remarkably similar. Genetically, any two people on Earth share the vast majority of their DNA. The genetic variation that does exist doesn't divide neatly into the traditional racial categories. In fact, there is often more genetic variation within a so-called racial group than between two different groups. That's because humans have always migrated, mixed, married, and moved across continents. Our history is one of connection far more than separation. Modern genetics doesn't deny that populations can differ in certain inherited traits. Skin color, hair texture, or susceptibility to some diseases can vary. But those traits don't form clear biological boxes called races. Nature is far messier than that, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. Race is real in its social consequences. It has shaped laws, opportunities, communities, and countless individual lives. But the rigid biological hierarchy once used to justify racism doesn't match what modern science has found. So, does that mean humans are naturally free from prejudice? Not exactly. Our brains are incredibly good at dividing the world into groups. Psychologists have shown that people can develop favoritism toward groups that were created completely at random. Sometimes all it takes is assigning people different colored shirts, or telling them they're on Team A instead of Team B. The groups mean nothing, yet people still begin favoring their side. That tendency isn't racism. It's a broader feature of human psychology known as in-group bias. Racism happens when those instincts become attached to ideas about race, reinforced by culture, institutions, and history. That's an important distinction. The instinct to form groups may be deeply human. The belief that one race is inherently superior to another is not. It was built, taught, reinforced, and because it was created by people, people also have the ability to challenge it. History isn't just a record of terrible ideas. It's also a record of those ideas being questioned, corrected, and sometimes abandoned. The story of racism isn't the story of humanity discovering a biological truth. It's the story of how a powerful idea grew out of specific historical circumstances, shaped societies for centuries, and was later challenged by both science and those who fought against injustice. Understanding that history doesn't erase its consequences, but it does remind us of something important. The most powerful inventions aren't always machines or technologies. Sometimes, they're ideas, and ideas can shape the world for generations, for better or for worse.